Good afternoon. My name is Claire Thomas. I'm with the Cape Eleuthera Institute, and today, as mentioned, I'm going to be trying to answer the question, would you sleep in a graveyard? In response to some queen conch behavioral trials that we're doing. So I don't think I have to stand up here and explain the importance of queen conch in the Bahamas. We know economically they're the #2 fishery, big export, but also consumed locally. Important ecologically, I remember the first of these conferences here, sitting in the audience and learning about how they're important for the health of seagrass beds, how they're important for biodiversity in the systems they're in, and finally, culturally important. So we have the coat of arms for the Bahamas up on the slide, and sitting right at the top is the queen conch. So many of us are probably also aware that there are a lot of problems facing the queen conch fishery, and we're seeing declines across several family islands, including Eleuthera, which I'll talk about, for several reasons. Overfishing or heavy demand in general, harvest of juveniles, the discrepancy in the legislation, so the ability to harvest a conch that has a flared lip that we know from newer science is immature, and poaching and other illegal activities. So I'll talk about some of the surveys that we've done in Eleuthera. So we've done local nursery surveys. So historically, Eleuthera has had some really healthy queen conch nursery grounds. So we've been able to, we had some data from the early 2000s, and we were able to go back and survey the same areas. So these shallow water habitats where normally the juveniles are aggregating, laying down transects and having people free diving down and quantifying the density of conch. So what do we see when we look at just a simple graph of the density per square meter? As we can see all the way on the left, the total number of conch, the blue bars being from fall 2003 and the orange being from fall 2013, we can see a huge decline, a very significant decline in the density of conch, both overall and particularly in juveniles. And remember, we said these are within nursery grounds, so you'd expect the majority to be juveniles. Whereas in 2003, we did see some adults. In 2013, we didn't see any in these shallow water nursery grounds. So that's one essential habitat. We also looked at breeding grounds of the queen conch. So we were able to get our hands on some data from 1993 that Alan Stoner had, going and doing these scuba surveys at depth, looking for these breeding grounds or these aggregations of adult conch. We were looking for things like the picture on the right, the shells on top of each other to kind of signify the act of mating, if you will. So we did several of these surveys in 2014, and you can see the x-axis is looking at different depth zones that we broke our dives into, and the y-axis is looking at the density. And once again, the blue bars represent older data, as in 1993, and the orange bars represent the data from 2014. And once again, across every depth zone, we see huge declines in the number of conch that we had found in our surveys. After we had resurveyed the same area, surveyed in 1993, we actually expanded out to 4 times the area, thinking maybe the aggregations had shifted, and we covered almost all of the what you would think would be suitable breeding habitat around our area of Cape Eleuthera, and we're not able to identify any large breeding aggregations. We did see, I think, whereas in 1993 they saw several dozen mating pairs, we saw 7, and where they had also seen several dozen egg masses, so your really positive sign that reproduction had occurred, we only saw, as pictured in this photo, we were lucky to get a photo of it since it was the only one, but that on the circle is a queen conch egg mass. So big declines in the breeding grounds. And then Midden. So middens are those pile of shells that you see when fishermen are cleaning their conch and tossing the conch on shore. And we have this midden in our boathouse right on our campus. And it's pretty cool because in 2003, that midden was comprehensively surveyed, and it was found that about 1/3 of the shells harvested there were juveniles, so very clearly lacking a flared lip at all. When we're comprehensively resurveyed it, we see that actually over the past 10 years, that number has jumped to almost 50% of the harvest now being juveniles. So we do see an increase in the harvest of juveniles in South Eleuthera. So to sum those 3 different studies up, our shallow water populations, we have low densities now, and we still have a constant fishing pressure. Every day we have at least 3 or 4 boats going out and harvesting in the shallow water. Our deep water breeding sites, huge declines, and really rare to see positive signs of reproduction. And then this really high prevalence of juvenile and subadult conch harvested. So we talked about all these issues already, right? So we know that there's this really heavy pressure. We know that we're harvesting juveniles and these subadults. We know that poaching and other illegal activity could be going on. But one of the interesting things that we wanted to touch on is every fisherman that I've spoken to about these declines that we're seeing, and members of the community have mentioned this graveyard theory, and many of you have probably heard of it as well. I've heard the way that someone first explained it to me was, would you want to sleep in a graveyard? And I said, no, I don't think I would. But the reason being is that some fishermen, when they're cleaning the conch, don't actually throw their shells offshore in these middens or onshore in these middens. They're actually cleaning the conch offshore and tossing the shells back at sea. And several fishermen have pointed out to me that they believe that that's a strong reason why we're seeing fewer conch in fishing grounds, is that the live conch are seeing their dead, knocked brother maybe and running away. And so we thought that would be an interesting thing to test. No one's looked at it so far as we know, so we thought it'd be a quick and simple study that we could do. So just to sum up, it's been theorized that conch are running away from these knocked shells. And at first you might have thought, oh, well, is there any reasoning behind that? Well, conch do have two eyes, right? They do have pretty decent vision, and they're all olfactory cues associated with animals that are injured. So there are several fish species, for example, that will emit an alarm cue when they're bit or injured that will alert other members of their species to run away. And so this wouldn't be the unheard of. This isn't unheard of for a conch to potentially react like that. But we were also wondering, having heard it as a reason from so many fishermen, we were just worrying that if we're focusing on this, it could be taking away from these other major causes of decline that I mentioned, like overfishing and taking of juveniles. So we're in Eleuthera, and our study site was basically in the shallow water Bahama Banks area that we've seen up on a couple slides earlier today. So what we did? Really simple methodology here. We thought it's a simple question, so let's approach it in the most simple way possible. So we start with a 2 by 2 meter quadrat that we laid out in the sea, anywhere from 1 to 3 meters deep. And then we introduce 4 treatments. So this black circle right here is going to represent one of a random treatment, either a freshly knocked shell, exactly addressing what our question is, an old knocked shell, maybe it's something visual that the conch are reacting to, not necessarily the chemical cues, a rock, so maybe it's just introducing something that's allowing them to move, and then trials where we had nothing. So the rock and nothing was acting, if you will, as a double control. The 6 pink triangles are representing the 6 conch that were in each trial. So several conch were collected and kept penned off in an area at sea, so they were still stayed within the natural environment, and 6 were chosen at random to be put in those quadrats that I showed earlier, and we would let trials run for 60 minutes. After 60 minutes, we would come back and actually record the distance from the treatment object. As you can see someone here measuring how far that conch has moved from the treatment object. And we were considering a significant distance moved as avoidance behavior, moving away from that object. So what did it look like in a schematic way? If this is how the trial was set up, after 60 minutes, it might look something like this. We see B and E over here. They haven't moved significantly more, let's say more than 10 centimeters, and maybe they're still touching the treatment object, so we would not measure that distance. We would not consider that any type of avoidance. Or you might have one like A, F, and D, and C here that have moved a significant amount away. So those would have been included as moved conch, and not only were we measuring distance, but also direction. So whether it was relatively parallel to shore, offshore, or inshore. So relatively simple setup. I will say right now, we're not finished with this study yet. So as of right now, we've run 40 trials. We've done 10 per each treatment. And the mean siphonal length for the conch that we've used within these trials has been 13 centimeters, which is relatively small. So these are mainly juvenile conch that we're working with as of now because in terms of being practical, that's the conch that we have that are the easiest for us to utilize to catch and use in these studies. So we'll talk about more what we want to do in the future. But the range of distance that these conch have moved, within 60 minutes, some have moved nothing, but some have moved over 700 centimeters. So that's quite a ways for a conch to move in only an hour. So of the conch that moved, 48% of the conch in our study did exhibit movement. And we can see here they're relatively the same amount moved parallel, inshore, or offshore. So no significant, it didn't really matter which way they were moving. They seemed to move any which way. Mean distance moved about 120 centimeters. And when we look at just the frequency, so the x-axis being the distance moved, most of the conch are moving less than 250 centimeters. And when we blow that up again, most are moving between 50 and 150 centimeters. So not moving very far in this 60-minute trial. When we pool all the sizes together and we look at each of the treatments, so a freshly knocked shell, an old knocked shell, a rock, or nothing, and we look at the mean distance moved, overall there's no significant difference between how far they moved versus what treatment they were in, which was surprising. And actually, the only one that was significant is the conch seemed to move the most when they were exposed to nothing. So almost the opposite of what we were expecting there. But when we took a closer look, so as I mentioned, there was no significant relationship between the size of the conch and the distance they moved, but when we only took out and looked at the conch that had a large flared lip, we did see that 100% of the conch that had the flared lip were moving. And in those trials, the greatest movement was in response to a freshly knocked shell. So do conch run away from knocked shells? As I just mentioned, there's no significant effect on the treatment object on this avoidance behavior when you look at it across all sizes. But when you just parse out the larger conch, they are more likely to move, particularly in relation to freshly knocked shells. And this is when I want to talk for a minute or two about the partner study that we're doing with Carleton University. So at Carleton, they did a very similar setup with the quadrats and the conch, but instead of a treatment object, they were actually using ground-up conch slop as an actual alarm cue. So using tissue from dead conch and injecting it near the vents in actual open seawater to see how conch were reacting to it. And what did they find right away? They found that no matter the size, more individuals were likely to move when exposed to this AC as alarm cue. So we see this over here, much more likely to move if they had the alarm cue as opposed to their control, which was just putting more seawater in the environment. They also found that larger conch over here were much more likely to move than smaller conch, and they moved much further. So larger conch were more than 3 times more likely to move than small conch. But they were only 1.36 times more likely to move when they had this alarm cue than when they're with the control. So what that's saying is no matter what, these large conch were moving, more so with the alarm cue, but both ways, and the small conch were pretty much staying put. So large conch more likely to move and move further than the smaller conch. But alarm cues in general were causing more conch to move more often and moving farther. So we can basically say that this alarm cue or this damaged tissue appears to cause some type of avoidance by larger individuals, and the juveniles are not demonstrating the same response. Although they are capable of moving just as far and having the same movement patterns, we're not seeing that. So why does that matter? Well, juvenile conch may be less able to avoid risky areas like fishing grounds where there's a lot of harvest going on, than their adults. Juveniles we find a lot of times in these larger aggregations, so they may be more susceptible to fishing pressure then. So if the big conch are going to move in an area where shells are being thrown overboard, only the small conch are going to remain, and if the same area is being fished, those small conch may be more susceptible to fishing pressure. And just a reminder that we do see such a large prevalence of juvenile shells in the harvested shells in our area. So what are the implications for this? Well, I'll say again, we need to collect more studies, so I wouldn't jump to any conclusions with any management suggestions at this point. I think if we are starting to see that juveniles might be more susceptible, then just, even though juveniles are meant to be protected and it is illegal to harvest them, maybe pointing more protection on their nursery grounds, but also improving our outreach and education initiatives. So being able to say that, yes, maybe they are moving, but that does not account, or that does not overshadow these other major reasons of decline. So we can't really be ignoring those either. So in the future, in the next 2 months, we're going to be running more of these trials with larger individuals, trying to see if that trend does hold up. We're also differing the size of treatment objects. Maybe a juvenile conch will react differently to a juvenile knocked shell as opposed to an adult knocked shell. Replicating this experiment in a tank environment to control for every variable but the treatment. And finally, doing field wild trials, so actually identifying natural aggregations in the wild and adding these treatment objects to see how their behavior might change. And so all of this is hopefully will be summed up in the next 2 months. Once again, would like to thank my partners working with at Carleton University and all the help that I had doing these trials in the field. And if you have a really burning desire to know the update of this study at the end of May, then we'll be posting updates on our blog at blog.ceibahamas.org, and there's our other social media. Thanks.